Okay, 6 o'clock. I'm gonna start the informational meeting for the Enosburg-Richford Unified District School Budget informational meeting. And at this point, I'm gonna turn over to Lynn.
Thank you all for coming. This is the first of 2 informational meetings that we'll have for the ER side of our budget. So I'm Lynn Coda, I'm the superintendent for Franklin Northeast.
I'm Morgan Daybell, I'm the business manager for Franklin Northeast.
So Morgan and I will be spending time going back and forth trying to explain our budget process and the current reality of education finance in the state of Vermont. So we have 2 goals around this meeting tonight. We're hoping that you walk away with any questions that you have answered. We also hope you walk away understanding that some of what you're hearing in the media in terms of what the reality is in the state of Vermont in terms of education funding and school budgets, how it's different here in both the ER side of the district and on the NMV side of the district. So those are our goals for tonight. The reality in Vermont is we've never really had this kind of a budget process. So on town meeting day, or soon after town meeting day, we had a total of 31 school budgets that were defeated across the state. Some of those have already had a second vote, and they have either passed or been defeated again. In Vermont, there are 14 schools who regularly vote on their budget outside of town meeting day, after town meeting day. And this was a unique year, and we'll describe more about that a little later in the presentation. There was a law passed this year called H-850. And that law allowed communities who had warned a budget to pull their budget back, make changes to their budget, and re-warn for a later date. And we're going to explain why that law was passed a little later on. So there were 8 school districts who chose, after their budgets were warned, to pull their budgets back and make some changes in their budgets and then re-warn those votes. Today actually is a pretty big day in terms of re-votes in Vermont. There are several districts who are re-voting their budgets today. So it'll be interesting for all of us to see the results of those budget revotes. And for those of you who don't know, our education funding system is a statewide funding system, so decisions that are made in other places have a direct impact on all of us, and we'll explain that as we go through this process. So this pie chart reflects the town meeting day results on the Enosburg-Richford vote. So you can see that there were 37% of our voters voted yes in support of the budget, and just under 63% voted no on the budget.
This shows the voting history for the Enosburg-Richford district at the bottom. In 2019, for the 2020 budget, was the first year that we voted as a unified system. And you can see the dates as they move up the list. On this side, support for the budget has been pretty consistent year over year prior to this one, always somewhere in the mid-60s in terms of a yes vote. This year, a significant change. We did have more yes votes than we did in the last 2, but a huge number of people showed up and voted no. We know we had a presidential primary that turned people out who normally aren't coming out to vote, so that had something to do with it, as well as the statewide narrative that we've been sort of fighting against since December 1st.
So this data reflects the number of people who turned out to vote in each of our communities. You had 384 people who voted in the town of Enosburg and 363 people who voted in the town of Richford.
When we meet with the boards in September to start the budgeting process, one of the first things we do to ground the conversation is look at enrollment history and enrollment projections. So on the left side of this graph, you'll see the last 5 years of October 1st enrollment. So we go in and we count kids on that day and see who's there. The next 5 years out are our enrollment projections, where we think the schools are going to be headed. And you can see on this district, the top red and green lines are the lines for the 2 high schools. And we are anticipating both to increase over the next couple of years and then level off in a little bit of a slight decline after that. Kind of an opposite trend on the 2 elementary schools. They're going to start declining in the next couple of years and then looks like they will both flatten out or rebound. And it's important to put this chart and this data into a statewide context. Statewide, we know we are losing students, growing population, more kids leaving the public education sector. And so our trends, even as we project them to be relatively flat, are sort of bucking the statewide trends. And especially places like southeastern Vermont, which are seeing pretty dramatic declines.
One additional thing I'll add about our enrollment is there has historically been a perception that we're a pretty small system in regard to the rest of the state, and we're actually the 13th largest system in the state, and we educate just under 2,000 students across our 6 towns and across our 9 schools.
So when the first budget went down, we reached out to folks and asked a number of questions around communication and their perceptions of the budget. There were 2 themes in terms of explaining the budget that arose. One was we don't go deep enough in terms of explaining how we get to tax rates, and the other is that we go too deep in terms of explaining how we get to tax rates. So we're trying to thread that needle. And at its most simple, we take the spending that's approved by the budget, we divide it by the number of kids, we divide it by the yield, which is a figure set by the legislature, and that gets to the tax rate. That formula stays the same from year to year. The spending is the amount that you all eventually approve, less any revenue that's coming in. So you approve a budget, we know we're going to get $3, $4, $5 million in tuition from other districts who are sending us their high school kids. The difference between that is what we need to take out of the state ed fund, and that's what drives our tax rate. The students is it's a number that we'll get from the Agency of Education at the end of each year. It's a weighted formula, so the state recognizes that some kids cost more to educate than others. We know that high school kids are more expensive to educate than pre-K kids who are only here 10 hours a week. So there's some math that goes behind that number, which we'll talk about later. The yield is a number, as I said, is set by the legislature, and what they do is they look at all the past budgets, they look at how revenues are coming in, how much money they need to raise in order to send money out to us to support those budgets. And that's what gets us to the district tax rate.
So on this visual, these lines right here reflect all of the districts across the state of Vermont. And at the very bottom, right here, that's the lowest spending system per pupil in the state of Vermont at around $8,000. Conversely, at the very top, there's a line up there that represents around $18,000 in terms of spending per pupil. Now, that data is reflective of the year that we're currently in, so this school year. So the other lines in this graph, all of those red lines represent our neighbors in Franklin County. So that's where each of those schools lands on this graph in terms of their per pupil spending. The very top black line here reflects the statewide average of per pupil spending. The black line below that represents the Franklin County average of per pupil spending. When you go further down, there's a blue line near the bottom. That's the Enosburg-Richford ERUUSD per pupil spending. Below that, there's another blue line that represents the NMV UUSD, so those are our other 4 elementary school towns. So on this data point, we are the 12th and 18th lowest spending in the state per pupil. On the next slide, this is really, this graph right here is really the bottom of the graph that I just showed you. So again, in our current school year, we've blown that up for you to take a look at. Those are the lowest 20 districts in the state in terms of their per pupil spending. So if you look over to the right, we have another data point, and this is reflective of the next year, the budgets that we're voting on right now. So if our first budgets had both been approved, we would have dropped from the 12th and 18th lowest spending systems in the state to the 9th and 10th lowest spending systems in the state. So our budgets were not approved. The boards, all 3 boards, went back and withdrew money from those budgets and decreased spending overall by about $1 million. So what that did, the Enosburg-Richford district actually dropped below NMV in their per pupil spending, and they dropped to the 8th and 9th lowest spending districts in the state. What happened this last week is that there was one other community that dropped below Enosburg-Richford. So we're back up to the 9th and 10th lowest spending in the state. What is interesting about this data is that those green lines below where we are, those reflect 4 systems in the state that don't actually operate schools. So those reflect Ira, Holland, Stratton, and Morgan, and none of those have schools that they send kids to. They all tuition all of their students. So the reality is us being 9th and 10th, we're really like 5th and 6th lowest spending per pupil for all the systems that actually operate schools.
So there's been a lot of press coverage around Act 127, and we've talked about it a lot at board meetings and public meetings, so I'll try to go through this kind of quickly. In Vermont, we have a constitutional guarantee to equal access to funding for our kids. This is part of the Brigham Court decision that came down in 1997, and it was put into law in, I think, 2000 under Act 60. What that did, or how we met the Brigham test, was to recognize that some kids cost more to educate than others, and we created this system of weights so that we knew, again, high school students would cost a little bit more, so districts that had more high school students got to count more kids. And then we tied those weights to that funding formula. So instead of your tax rate being tied to your grand list directly, it was really tied to how much you were spending per kid. When Act 60 was put into place, they knew some kids cost more to educate than others, but they didn't really have any data, or they didn't go after any data in terms of what that difference was. So they knew also that kids who grew up in poverty probably cost more than kids who didn't. Kids who didn't hear English spoken at home probably cost more money than kids who didn't. Act 127 in part was meant to get some data behind those numbers. And so they hired UVM to look at those weights. UVM made some suggestions which got put into law, and those factors changed pretty radically, but that formula stayed the same, and that has been the same since 2000 and the Brigham decision. For our 2 districts up here, it meant that we were going to be able to count a lot more kids. We were going to have a bigger share of the pie of students across the state. They gave more of a weight to kids in poverty, and we have a lot of kids in poverty. They gave more of a weight to English language learners, and we have a handful of those. They created some new weights, so they gave weight to kids who are living in sparsely populated areas, which is both of our districts. They're recognizing that it costs more to move those kids on buses than it does in, say, a Burlington. So those weights changed, and we were one of the districts, or 2 of the districts, that benefited from that. So you could say since 2000, we had been kind of laboring under this scheme that really didn't give us the credit that we deserved in terms of student count. Act 127 corrected that. The legislature knew that the boards, when they got that new number, could do one of 2 things, or a combination of 2 things. They could say, great, we have a lot more kids, we're not going to spend any more money, and we're going to drive our tax rate down. Or they could say, great, we have a lot more kids, we can keep the tax rate the same, and we can spend a lot more and try to address some of those needs that are now being recognized under Act 127. Go ahead.
You were going to say it, I think.
On the flip side, there are districts who were seeing a decline in terms of their relative share of kids. The legislature knew that they needed time to right-size their budgets, or assumed they needed time to right-size their budgets. And so what they did was they gave them a 5-year sort of transition plan. And the way they did that, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, is they initially had said no district's tax rate can go up more than 5%. So if you are at $1, your tax rate can go up to more than $1.05, and that's that pre-CLA tax rate. So go to the next one.
Before you do, there is one thing about Act 127. Part of the reason that they wrote this law is there's a huge discrepancy between the lowest spending districts and the highest spending districts in the state. And they're looking at that under Brigham and the equal access to public funding for education. And their thinking was the systems at the bottom should be spending more and creating more opportunities, and they were trying to allow systems like ours to be able to do that without it negatively impacting our taxpayers, while they were forcing those systems at the top to start to bring their spending down so that we could close that gap between the highest and the lowest. So losing some opportunities on that end of the spectrum and gaining some opportunities on our end of the spectrum.
So the yield, which I mentioned before, is how the legislature sort of divvies up the taxes across all districts. And so as education spending anywhere in Vermont declines, the yield can go up. And as the yield goes up, everyone's tax rate across the state goes down. That's more relevant for us this year because of the tax rate floor. And what that is there's a provision in statute that says your tax rate cannot go below $1. That was really intended for places like Avery's Gore, Buell's Gore. There are a couple of places that don't operate schools. They may not even have any kids in their town from one year to the next, but they have property, and because we have a statewide system, the state wants to tax that property. And so they're saying you cannot fall below that $1.
The district tax rate.
District tax rate, sorry. So this very ugly graph is showing what has happened to our tax rate since January through about mid-February. And so the red line here is the Enosburg-Richford tax rate for this current year before CLA. It's somewhere right around $1.18, $1.17, I think. When the Enosburg-Richford board approved the first budget that we voted on, first week in January, they did it thinking that the tax rate that we were putting in front of voters would have been $1.15, so a little over a penny drop. About a couple days later, on this side it might have even been the next day, the legislature changed its yield prediction, which is this yellow line, and so the same budget, because of that different yield, was now at $1.18 and change, so maybe a penny upwards. This is the point where we had to start printing books and sending information out to voters, and we used that $1.18. Another week goes by, they get some different information, the yield rate goes back up, tax rate goes back down. We're now sitting here thinking, okay, now we're at $1.13, and that's a comfortable place to land for trying to sell a budget to voters. Right around here is when the legislature started tuning in to some unintended consequences around that 5% cap that they had given out to everyone. Several of us have been, saying the sky is falling since November, but what many districts, when they were going into their first budget meetings, realized was there's nothing we can do to get this tax rate down below a 5% increase. We'd have to cut 50 people in order to get that. So we know no matter what we do, our tax rate's gonna be X. We also know that we have a building that we've not been able to get a bond for a new roof. It's gonna cost $6 million. We can put that in this year's budget. It doesn't affect our tax rate. We know we've got some capital needs coming down the road. We can put in another $5 million in our capital reserve fund, save it for a rainy day. It's not gonna affect our tax rate. Because we are a statewide system, somebody has to pay for that. And because our two districts were nowhere near that cap, we were two of the many that were gonna have to pay for that. So they came back to folks in the field and said, okay, what are you projecting in your budgets now? And when they got that data, they realized that because of all that additional spending and because those systems that were capped wouldn't have to contribute to that spending, that yield rate was gonna fall pretty precipitously, and our tax rate, if we didn't get the cap, was gonna go up to $1.52. The legislature took some quick action on that, thankfully, and they changed that transition mechanism from, instead of everyone gets capped at a 5% increase, we're gonna look at how many kids you had before Act 127 and how many kids you had after Act 127, and we'll give you a penny discount on your tax rate based on that. So some places got 20 cents off, some places got 2 cents off. Places like us, because we gained, didn't see any cut. But because of the mechanism there, that additional $6 million that they put in for the roof and the $5 million that they put in for the capital reserve was now going to be borne by their taxpayers. They also, in H850, recognizing that, said, you know, if you want, even though you've all started voting in a lot of cases with early voting, you can pull back your budgets and you can rewarn them, and we will change statute to allow you to do that. They recognize that because of that change, there were budgets that were going to go down because of that additive spending, and now they were going to have to pay for it. We did not do that because we were never budgeting towards that cap, because we honestly never thought we would get close to it. So we didn't even have those discussions at our two districts. And so the important thing to remember at this point, they fixed it, the yield goes back up. Our tax rate is now down to about $1.10 based on those estimates. And all through this roller coaster ride, we never changed our budget here. That was all changes at the legislature impacting it. This is the tax rate as actual for the first 5 years of our existence, and then projected right now. We do not have that yield figure from the legislature. We are, with this dot here, anticipating it's going to be at $10,000. At this point, that's just an educated guess. But you can see the first 2 years of our existence, there was a slight increase each of those 2 years, and then the tax rate started dropping pretty significantly for the next 3, largely due to the increasing statewide grand list, because properties are selling for so much more than they have in the past. Want to call your attention to this line here, which is that $1 point. And so once this dot falls below $1, we are capped at $1 tax rate, even if it should have been 98 cents or 97 cents. We are still taxed at $1, and that extra money that we're not spending here is going to the state, and it's just going out into the ed fund to everyone else. And so as we were working budget round 2 with the board, for the first time in my 12 years doing this, we were kind of having serious conversations about how you don't want to fall below that point. You don't want to be giving back money to the state. And so they were weighing a need to be responsive to the budget defeat and cut costs, but not get so close to that dollar that the legislature would say, we're going to move all this additional revenue in. That's going to be great for the yield. It's going to drive down tax rates. And now instead of predicting $1.01, we're at 98 cents, and we're leaving money on the table in our 2 towns.
So another way to say that is, if we continue to cut opportunities, not knowing where that yield is going to land, we could be cutting those opportunities without it having any positive effect on our taxpayers, because the dollar it can't go below that. So one of the things that we talked about at the board level is, you've got these 31 districts. We know that there were 8 districts that pulled back and delayed, and we know that 31 defeats. Most budgets, when they're defeated, are not going to come back higher than what they warned the first time. So every time one of those districts or systems pulls money out of their budget, that's actually going to help us by increasing the dollar yield, which will drive our tax rates down. So we've had to predict. We always have to predict about the yield, because it's never set until the end of the legislative session. But this year has been challenging because we know it's going to move. And it's just a matter of, did we strike the right balance with the amount of money that we took out? And we hope that we don't go below the dollar floor.
And the other wrinkle with that yield is that as large school systems like South Burlington, like Champlain Valley, like MMU, see budget defeats, their budgets are so huge that they may take out 2 or 3% of their budget to try to go back out to voters, but that's going to be impactful enough that could push the yield up and tax rates down. Because again, it's a statewide system, and what matters in terms of setting the yield is what we are all spending collectively. We take this district tax rate, and then it's impacted by the common level of appraisal, or the CLA. This is a figure that the tax department calculates, and what it is a recognition that the grand lists, which is what we apply the tax to, in different towns have different levels of accuracy. So tax sales or property sales in towns that have a lot of second homes have probably been doing better in this market than towns that are more rural residential farming. We also know that towns are reappraising on a different schedule. So Enosburg probably hasn't had a reappraisal in 10 years. Richford just had one. And so in theory, those grand lists have different levels of accuracy. So the tax department is looking at sale data and coming up with figures for each town to sort of show how far off they think their grand list is from fair market value. So for an example, and we'll get into real numbers in a minute, if your town CLA is 80% and your house has a grand list value of 100,000, what that really means is the state thinks your house has a fair market value of 125, or that's what it would sell for. On the flip side, if your CLA is above 100%, it means your fair market value is below that $100,000, and we tend to see that in the first couple of years after a reappraisal. In Montgomery, when I was on the board and you were the principal, we went through a reappraisal and our CLA went up to 130%. So they said you kind of overshot by 30%. Statewide, CLAs are falling generally. Again, it's impacting some towns, each town differently. Some towns are falling faster than others, but that is due to the real estate market that we've had in the last 3 years, primarily second homes selling for a lot more than they had in the past. This graph shows the impact of the CLA over the last 6 years for Enosburg and for Richford. So again, this black line is the district-wide tax rate. So this is the one that the board controls directly. In Enosburg, their CLA has been going up pretty steadily each year, and so they're moving sort of opposite of the way that the district-wide tax rate is going. That's kind of normal in an increasing real estate market. Richford's is much different, so it tended to be pretty level for the first 4 years, and then in FY24, that was the first year you had reappraised here. And so that house that was listed for $100,000 is maybe now listed for $150,000. That CLA rose pretty dramatically, and that dropped the rate. We're seeing that drop increase pretty significantly as I had said, that those new appraisals are sort of catching up with market value. And we saw this again in Montgomery 10 years ago. Go ahead. Yep.
So do we want to see the CLA drop or increase as far as dollars and cents for our taxes?
In terms of the taxes you pay, you don't want to see it drop. You want to see it stay flat.
I think
when you're
last
thinking
year-
about
Why don't you get 100?
Yeah, last year was like 134%, and this year's like 105.
Yeah.
And that's the difference you're seeing between the 86 cents and the 98 cents. That's where you're seeing that swing.
So if you're looking at your tax bill, if you're looking at what your property's worth, a falling CLA means that properties are doing better in your town, and there's a certain benefit for that as well, even if you're not putting it on the market next year. So go to the next one, Courtney, and I think we'll show it to you in actual dollar amounts. And we will put this slide deck up on our website so you don't have to take notes or squint too hard. We've modeled this in both towns for a $100,000 house, a $200,000 house, and a $300,000 house per the grand list value. So in Enosburg, a $100,000 house with a 74% CLA, which is their CLA this year, has a fair market value of $134,000. Again, that CLA is so low because it's been so long since they've reappraised. In Richford, which just did reappraise, that house that's listed for $100,000 on the grand list actually has a fair market value of $93,000. And so those different tax rates are the state's attempt to get you to pay based on your fair market value rather than on your listed value. You can see the impact for a $200,000 and $300,000 house for both towns as well. In Enosburg, in FY24, the year that we're in now, a house that was listed for $100,000 had a tax bill of $1,400 if you were not paying based on your income. In FY25, that's gone up by about 1% to $1,414, assuming budget round 2 passes and assuming that our prediction on the yield amount is right. So an Enosburg resident with a $100,000 house would spend $1,414 or $14 up. In Richford, the amount of tax paid is dramatically lower because of that CLA, so it would go up from $869 this year to $981, so $112 increase on a $100,000 home, but still paying almost $500 for 30 less than what somebody in Enosburg is paying on the same listed value.
Can I ask another question?
Yep.
So this is that CLA,
Yep.
but do you know what it's gonna be yet for sure?
We think
Is
these
that-
numbers
is
are
that-
final, so we get
You do know
them
they're
towards
final.
the end of December, yeah.
Okay.
I would say we're 99% that they're final. There could be changes if there are people contesting it, like towns contesting it, and that has happened in the past. I don't know of any of ours that are doing that.
So this chart you've got, you feel it's relatively, it's accurate? I mean, as far as,
I think the one variable that's still out there is the yield amount, and that's something that we won't
and is
know.
that the state?
The legislature sets that, and they tend to set it on their way out of town. So it's likely to be the end of May when we get it. We've been, I think, drifting towards a number that we think we're more confident in.
So the vote's gonna come up and we're voting on something, but we don't actually know if that's the right tax rate.
It's
You
always,
never
it's
know.
always that
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
because of the way the
This year
formula
just
is.
seems to be
This year, there's been a lot
a
more
little bit
play.
more.
Yeah,
But we're so close to that $1 for the district tax rate that it's not gonna adjust it that much, I don't think. The CLAs was driving everything right now. And now we have no control over the CLA.
but if that yield number falls, if they decide they're not, and there's a lot of new revenue that they're talking about putting in there. If they pull some of that back, the yield could fall and that rate could go up. And the, the 1,400 and the 869 would still be the same, but those other numbers could go up.
That's kind of like the hard part is, voting on, this year is different. For some reason, this is different, I guess because of dollars. It's like, it's hard to vote on something that's really not sure it's right or accurate.
Right.
It's
And-
accurate to the best of your
Right.
ability.
And that's been the challenge explaining budgets since Act 60 in 2000, because it used to be, we could go to you and say, yeah, your tax rate is gonna be this, and know that with certainty. The problem was, we knew that Berkshire's tax rate was gonna be $2.50, and Stowe's tax rate was gonna be 20 cents, because those grand lists were so far off. And so we basically bought some equity in the system for some uncertainty.
So every year it's like this. Every year
Yes.
since 2000, it's been like this, that we don't really know what our tax rate's gonna be. And last year, our tax rate went down significantly after the reappraisal happened. However, people paid more in taxes.
A lot more in taxes.
Because their property was worth more. But that's not because the tax rate from the school spending was more. That's because your property's worth more, so you're paying more. So it's a complicated
complicated.
system
It's
to
complicated.
understand. Yeah.
So, if our tax rate was if we paid more because of the appraisal last year, what's driving it this year? I mean, because it seems like we're more closely appraised, so then we're tighter in the range.
Yeah.
So what's driving Richford's tax increase over Enosburg? Is it all strictly because of the CLA?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, so the fact that we're more closely appraised means we owe more?
It's not that you're more closely appraised. The reason yours is going up more is your CLA is moving faster. So Enosburg's has been pretty steady. You've got more variation because you've got this brand new grand list that they're now pushing their data against.
In theory, you were overassessed last year because you went up to 135%.
Yeah.
So that's dropping, which is a good thing for your property values. But you dropped more sharply than the others, so it's bringing you up to that 98 cents over the 86.
See, Enosburg stayed the same, 74.71, and ours went from 130 down to 107. And so when your CLA drops, your tax rate goes up.
But I thought being closer was better.
It is.
when I read your book, it made it sound, when I read your first book, it made it sound like you want to be close. You want to, if you're up, if your CLA's like that 133, it made it sound like you should, that's better than if it's below.
Yeah, and so yours being at 107
Yeah.
and Enosburg's being at 74 is why you'd be paying 981 and they're
Well,
paying
I guess I read that
1414.
in your little book. I read that differently because you made it sound like it was a positive to have your CLA be higher.
It is.
It drives your taxes down. I mean, I think the positive would be if your CLA was 100%, it means your listers have
Yeah.
right on and you don't have to
But I mean, it
change.
doesn't seem like that. Their Enosburg CLA is 26% off. Ours is off 7. So I'm not. I guess I.
But if you look at the total number of what you're paying, I think.
I get that.
I mean, they're paying 14 and Richford's paying 900.
I think it's because last year was 135 and
Yeah.
this year is 107, so it like decreased
Yeah, right.
drastically.
Well, and we knew that. We knew.
Yeah.
We knew the appraisers were way off.
And it also depends, unfortunately, on what properties have sold, because, I mean, I don't know how many sell in Richford in a given year, or how many they look at, but you probably don't have as many comparables here as they do in Burlington, would be my guess.
So another way to look at that is just that, I hear what you're saying about the being closer to a 100 as something that's better. I think if you look at their $1.41 tax rate after their CLA is applied and your 98-cent tax rate, that's the way that you're in a better position. It's not the difference between last year and this year. Like when you track that over,
I
I'm
get it.
gonna
I get we're
differ.
still paying less, but we're also.
We're paying more because our grant list is a lot higher than
Exactly.
Enosburg's.
Well, and we're,
Your individual
Yeah.
properties, in theory, are more accurate.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, we're looking at, a
But
huge tax hike last year. And again, I mean, at some point, there's gotta be I know maybe it doesn't come out on the school side, but at some point, there's gotta be some leveling out. I mean, you can't have 2 years of substantial, huge tax increases. I mean, I think mine's pushing 1,300 over the 2 years. I mean, that's crazy, It's a huge percentage, and I mean, there's got to be some. I get all the variables, but that's what the voters look at. Like,
They're gonna look at the bottom line, how
Yeah.
much is it,
yeah,
what
I
is
mean,
it costing me?
and I think if
They're not
you
looking
could
at
say,
the
hey,
school or-
this is a one-time thing, people might well buy off on it. But I mean, I don't think you can tell us that. So next year we could be looking at, the same rate again.
We can't tell you in terms of the tax rate because we don't control that.
Yeah.
We can look forward to spending and say, if health insurance goes up another 16%, the budget's gonna go up another 2%. We know that there are two things that are sort of working in our favor, and this is a statewide issue, is that a number of systems, we did some as well, had those positions that were funded through ESSER, so kind of off books. This was the year that if we wanted to keep them, we needed to bring them in the local budget. We brought some in, not all of them. Some districts brought in more, but statewide, that's pushed spending up. The other factor, one of the few bright spots going into next year is that those cent decreases that I talked about under H850, 20% of those go away each year for the next couple of years. And I don't know how much they cost, but they're pretty significant when you apply it to a MMU budget or a Champlain Valley or South Burlington budget, which is already significantly higher than ours.
And they reduce, not only do 20 fall away, they reduce by a certain number of cents each step in those 5 years.
I guess I would just say, I think, talking to voters, what they're looking, maybe you can buy off on this, if it's stabilizing out and it's gonna be more reflective of the historic, or what you should hope for, the 2 to 3, maybe 4%, but not a 13%, or what it was before, 20, or 21, 2% in the book.
The first vote.
I mean, I think that's, That's what the
was
voters
the
are looking
21,
for.
22%? What are you talking about?
The last vote. the last-
He's talking
the last
about the
vote.
increased spending in the budget, but I thought that the slide that you showed before, the increased spending because of the weights was really not an increase with per pupil spending. So you.
Yeah, I meant to go back, I was gonna ask that
Yeah.
you go back to one of
Which
your
one?
first
I
slides.
think what you're
The
looking at
slide
is
with
the increase is a CLA difference, going from 130%.
And I get that,
This
but
is
I
talking
mean,
about
where
the
you had
spending.
the chart, the historic chart.
I mean,
So-
overall, it's still reflective, it's not, I mean, I get your spending is.
That one.
Yeah, that one there. Like, how do we go from 18 to 10?
So that is because we started counting kids differently under Act 127.
So,
And so, you know, unfortunately, this is really the only number that we can use to compare one district to another in terms of their spending, because it accounts for size and accounts for those differences in students. It looks wonky here because we had one way of counting
yeah, it
kids
looks
up
like,
until
yeah,
this
it
point.
does. It looks like $7,200 and you drop it and you got a 15% increase.
Yep, and that's because we have twice as many kids as we get to count because of those
the
weights.
weighting, we were supposed to spend more money to get more
Seems like voodoo
opportunity.
math.
What?
It really does seem like voodoo math. You know, it should be straight line.
It should,
you
but
know,
it's not
know-
because of the weighting.
It used to be complicated when you were on the board, and now it's like that on steroids, to be completely honest with you. And in terms of us like projecting out what's going to happen
Yeah,
next
well,
year, I would not dare to do that, Wally, because there's a lot of volatility.
Yeah.
And one thing I would just say to you is, I hear what you're saying about the 13% because of the way your CLA has moved. And I would also just remind everyone to look at, please also consider what our district tax rate has done since we've merged and how close we are to the dollar floor. So if people are making decisions at the polls, you could force this district back to the drawing board to take another look at their spending plan, and they could choose to take out more money. That yield could land where it's going to land, and it might not change what your tax rate is going to be, because once you hit that dollar floor, that's it. So we could cut more money, reduce opportunities, and you might not feel any difference.
And other schools and other towns can be getting part of our money out of your dollar. And that's the thing that concerns me the most, that if we voted this down, because we're really close to that dollar, and if we vote it down and we're still paying $1, everybody's still paying $1, part of our money from the Enosburg-Richford district goes to the Stows and the South Burlingtons.
Well, you say you're close. I mean, it looks like you have a 10% window there.
It's $1.05 right now.
I thought one of your other charts said it was $1.10.
He had only gone to a certain date. The point of that chart was to show the impact of the yield during that period of time on the tax rate, and how there's a relationship, but it only went through February.
And this is FY25 is where we think it's going to end with our yield projection now. So we're at about $1.05.
Right now, you say the tax rate's $1.05.
That's our guess,
He's
yeah.
talking about the yellow chart with the.
Yeah, that only went to mid-February.
Yeah.
And that was the first budget we warned. This is now the second budget.
But we don't know what the state's gonna do for sure. You know, something else you said, like, and I'm gonna piggyback on what Wally's saying about, you know, I mean, I had a tax increase last year too, you know? I think probably you did too, John.
Yes.
You know, and it's like, there's a lot of people that, you know, it's a rural area. There's a lot of people that don't own property. They live here, but they don't own property, they don't pay taxes. So that falls on the property owners. You know, there's a lot of rentals here, and I mean, I don't know, just to me, if there was more actual people that are paying taxes, it would be better.
We're actually going to
You
talk
can't
about
change
that in a couple
Can't
of
change that
slides.
though, you know?
And if they're renting, that property is still being taxed.
It
It's
is,
just
but I
somebody
don't
else
think those properties are probably
is writing a
taxed
check.
on it. You know, I'm pretty sure part of a lot of those properties aren't as high value as some of the houses.
Yeah, right.
It'd be interesting if they couldn't vote for a school budget if they didn't have they don't have, because essentially they don't have any skin in the game. If what they were voting on and impacted them, folks would look at it differently.
One thing to think about is that your tax bill and what you pay at that time is only one piece of the puzzle. Are you gonna talk about income sensitivity? So Morgan's gonna talk about that. I know people who got $2,000 back in their taxes this year, or tax credit, because of their income. So at income tax time, we're only looking at one piece of the puzzle at a time, and unless you look at it as a whole picture, it's difficult.
Are you talking about the rebate or?
Yeah.
But not everybody gets that.
Yeah.
No, not everybody, I don't get it, but I mean, it depends on your income and it's income sensitivity.
Yes, but it's
Morgan
up
will
to,
talk about
yeah.
that.
We can go on, I mean, it goes up to 125,000, potentially get it. It's pretty generous. Oh no, Lindsay, talk about stuff.
Then I'll turn it back to you. So after the budget was defeated, the board came back together. All three boards actually met, and they made some hard decisions around where they were going to go with their budgets. There were two things that they wanted to prioritize. One is we have a teacher shortage across the country, and there are far fewer people who are going into education than there ever has been before, so it's really challenging to fill our positions. So one thing that all three boards wanted to do was to prioritize existing staff. So they chose not to make reductions in existing staff, in existing teacher staff. So all of our contracts have gone out at this point. The student programming was also something that was a high priority for our boards. They really didn't want to make cuts that had a direct impact to programming. So one exception to that is that the FNESU budget included the Flexible Pathways Academy, which was a fully virtual option for attending school. And our numbers had declined in that. We were down to around 10 students who were in that, so we eliminated that as an option. So that's the one program that was cut. I will say that if this budget does not pass, they're going to have to go back and look at where do we go from here. The dollar floor is going to be a heavy part of that conversation, and if they choose to make further cuts, they're going to have to look at which of the positions haven't been filled yet, and they may or may not tell me don't fill any more, and then look at existing staff and move people around either within buildings or within the district to try to cover staffing for the year. And then they'd have to look at other elements of the budget, which could include student programming. So we are hopeful that we won't have to go back for a third round.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a statewide funding system. All the money that's raised to support those budgets goes into the education fund, and then it goes back out to districts based on the budgets that they pass. In this current year, property tax after the income sensitivity credits make up about 25% of the ed fund. Non-homestead property tax makes up about 39%. And then the rest of that comes from other sources, primarily sales tax. There's also some rooms and meals tax that goes in there, lottery, Medicaid, and some other dedicated and relatively small funding streams that go in there. And the next one. So in our district, in ER, what that looks like is this darker quarter of the pie is how much we're receiving this year that comes from residential property tax after any income sensitivity payments. So this green quarter is what we raise in residential property tax in Enosburg. This red piece is what we raise in Richford from residential property tax. And then this blue wedge is what we get from residential property tax that comes from somewhere else. That's other towns paying into the ed fund, and we're getting that. Similar story for non-residential tax. Again, green is Enosburg's contribution to non-residential tax. Pink is Richford's contribution to non-residential tax. And this lighter blue is what we get from non-residential tax raised somewhere else. And again, that is second homes, businesses, rental properties, primarily what are taxed on that. And then this remaining, a little more than a third, is what we get in our district from sales and use tax, rooms and meals, lottery, Medicaid money coming in. And so what's important to keep in mind here is that of that money that we spend, and this year was just under 17, a relatively small piece of it, these 2 green and 2 red slices, are what we raised within our 2 towns. Everything else is coming from somewhere else. That's maybe more relevant on the NMV side. My town of Montgomery is still pretty convinced that it's a gold town and that they're sending in all this money to the state ed fund and not getting it back. We are not at all close to that unless we fall below this dollar floor. And we would still get money from somewhere else, but we would not be getting the amount we should. As we go through the budgeting process with the boards, we kind of show them their budget with 2 kind of big picture lenses. This is what we buy, and so everything in red here is what we spend on our staff, salaries, health insurance, and other benefits. The section in blue is what we spend largely on other people's staff. So contracted services might be NCSS workers that we contract with. Tuition would be money that we send out to other tech centers for kids that are going there, or to pre-K providers that we tuition kids to. Other services is a catch-all, and maybe 2/3 of that is money that comes to the supervisory union for our staff, so special educators, food service employees, and then contracted services like our transportation contract. The main point of this slide is to focus them on this less than 5% of what's called materials. Those are supplies and utilities, so that's what we spend on crayons in our kindergarten, paper in all our schools, Chromebooks for kids in our high schools. It's also what we spend on the light bill and what we spend on the fuel bill. And so when we get into budget discussions about if you just bought fewer devices, you could save so much money on taxes, or 20 years ago it was if you spent less in photocopying, we could save so much money on taxes. What we're really talking about is a small portion of this less than 5%. If we need to cut money in our budgets, it's coming from either our people or someone else's people, because that's what we spend education dollars on. The next slide will show the same budget, but basically on what we do. So about half of it is what we consider direct instruction. This is teachers and paraeducators in front of students. Small amount for special ed. This blue section is loosely called support services. So we have guidance counselors and nurses. We'll have librarians, technology, and some teacher training. A small slice for district level expenses. So cost of the board, the cost of legal fees, the cost of insurance that we pay on a district level. School administration is your principals, assistant principals, their admin assistants across our 5 schools. Central services is the piece of the pie that goes to that supervisory union budget, and we'll break that down in a little more detail later, but it's primarily special education and then transportation and food service. Lastly, buildings and grounds. This is what it costs to clean and maintain our 5 buildings. There's a bigger red line on the NMV side for debt service. We've now retired almost all of the debt on buildings in our 2 districts, and so that's not relevant for this district.
Where does the central office staffing fall into that into there?
All of the central office assessment is here, so that 14%. And again, we'll break down later. Special ed is the biggest piece of that. Transportation, food service, and then we get into the pieces like Lynn and I. But we've got a slide that breaks that down further.
So one of the things that we did the survey to the community after the budgets were defeated and wanted to know what questions people had. And there were a lot of questions around central office because I think a lot of the work that we do isn't visible to most people. So one of the things that was asked was how much of what we do is actually required by law. So I took a couple of examples of some of the things that we do. about 10 years ago, it was back when I was building principal. I'm sure Beth can remember when this happened too. Before our merger, we had 5 town school districts, one for each of our own communities. And we all used to have our own transportation contracts, and we had policies, and we had, everything was kind of organized. We had, each had a collective bargaining agreement. So there was a recognition in the legislature that it's silly that we have all of these individual things. We should be organizing at the supervisor union level so that we could get greater efficiencies by doing it as a whole rather than having all of these smaller contracts. So there were several things that they looked at and contemplated when they made this change. One was around wanting curriculum to development and curriculum resources to be organized at the central office level, so there was some consistency across the organization. Anything related to educational assessments and building a local comprehensive assessment plan, professional learning at our level, special education services, until that time were all school-based, so those were in those town budgets, and we were required to pull all of those special educators out of the town budgets and make them FNESU employees at that time. Student transportation, we merged and had just one transportation contract rather than 5. Anything that had to do with financial management, it all came to the SU level. Anything involving coordination of services, no matter kind of what those services are, data management and reporting and community engagement. So that was out of that one statute. Those are some of the examples of the functions that they really were looking at, both financial efficiencies and the ability to be more effective by doing it at the system level. Another law was passed called Act 173, and that was really within around the last 5 years. And there were other things that were required of us in terms of the system level work that they were expecting. And for people who work within the system, they recognize several of these things because it's been work that we've been doing for the past 5 years. So really looking at how we support students in our what's called our multi-tiered system of supports. It's looking at what do we do in the classroom, what do we do when some kids need a little extra help and intervention, what do we do as we get closer to special education, and what do we do for students when they need something totally different. So it's building upon designing our instruction to meet all students where they're at. They also made pretty significant changes in the special education rules and regulations, so those are things that we're having to apply at our level. There were things, some of this is repetitive because it was included in the other bill, also I'll skip some of this. Transition planning for students was also contemplated. Work around equity and inclusion and thinking about what all students need in order to access their learning was a big part of that. And then they noted here things about complying with state and federal requirements. So what we've done, there's another slide that we don't have in here, but we really try to take a crack at it. A lot of times we try to just take care of the things so that the principals aren't stuck being managers tending to, this audit or this survey or these requirements. We'll just take it on and do it at our level because our goal is to not have Beth be here working as a manager in the school. We want Beth to not be thinking about boilers, and we don't want her to be worrying about teacher licensure and things like that. We want her to be able to be an instructional leader because we know that's what's going to improve in teachers' practice in order to improve learning for our students. So those are some of the pieces that we hold that are just a little less visible.
So there are 2 slides that we've been using with the SU board as we develop budgets. This first one is looking at what we do if we were a single unified system. So we took the new NMV budget, the new ER budget, and the new SU budget, put them all together, and then tried to get rid of the duplication. So the $3.5 million, whatever it is, that NMV sends to you and to Enosburg High School for tuition students is pulled out of there. And then this is the same categories as we had discussed before. So you can see about half is direct instruction. There's a bigger chunk now for special education because that's coming in from the SU. Voc Ed, athletics, co-curricular, relatively smaller. Student support, again, is guidance counselors and nurses. Instructional support, be librarians, some technology, as well as teacher training. This general administration sliver here is, again, at the district level, it's the cost for the board, district level insurance, legal fees, audits, things like that. It's also some of the people at central office, namely Courtney and Lynn, people who are at the overall district management level. School administration, similar to the local budgets, are what it costs to run the 9 buildings we have now with principals, assistant principals, and their admin assistants. Central services is primarily the people in the background at central office. So I'm in there, my bookkeepers are in there, HR is in there. We have a lot of district level technology expenses that are in there as well. Buildings and grounds, now maintaining 9 buildings, and you can see food service as about 5% of the whole budget, significantly more if you're just looking at the SU and then the transportation contract. And then we also took now just the SU budget coming up in a moment, and we were looking at where we were spending that money. So if you start with the alternative programs that we've built and work your way with these small pieces of pie around the clock, these are expenses that we budget for and we pay for at the supervisory union, but we know that they're specific to a school. So Richford High School, we know who your special educators are, or at least we're budgeting for special educators. We know who your behavioral technicians are, and we are kind of pulling those out and trying to get a sense as an SU what costs, like that first slide that Lynn showed, are we really holding but able to allocate to the schools. You can see food service is about 18% of the SU budget. Transportation is 13.5% of our budget. We don't try to split those out by schools, I think, for obvious reasons. And then SU-wide, there's still about a third that we can't easily allocate to schools. So some of that are the people who are up here, and we don't, we're not tied day to day to a specific school. We also have the instructional coaches that Lynn mentioned earlier. We don't know where those new teachers are going to be hired any given year, and so we're holding them at the SU and deploying them as needed. Your English language teacher, English language learner teachers are there as well, because we don't know where those kids or where those needs are going to be. OT and PT, there's some other support services that we hold at that, in addition to the traditional central office costs.
So just in terms of our communication plan, we recognize it's hard for people who don't have kids in school to receive information about the school budgets. We have, we're trying to have a heavier presence on social media right now to get information out about these information meetings. We certainly appreciate all of you taking the time to come out tonight. We have a mailer that we finalized over the weekend, so you should see something in your mailbox late this week, early, mid next week, but certainly about a week before the actual vote hits. We're trying to post things in town clerks and libraries, and again, our website has a lot of information as well. We've added Front Porch Forum. We know there are some people in the community that see that when they don't see our websites. We decided we typically do informational meetings for regular budget votes, but we decided this time we would do one in every town. So between the 2 districts, we have 6 of these informational sessions that we're running, and we also have run 6 informational sessions for our staff in our schools, because again, our goal was to make sure that people had questions about the budget, because it is so complicated, more complicated than it's really ever been, that they have an opportunity to get those questions answered. So people have asked how can we help. I think being here and being informed before you vote is really important. Knowing the difference between what's happening here in FNESU and what's happening in other parts of the state is also really important. In terms of voting, people should know that they can register to vote right up until the day that voting happens. You can register on that day. Absentee ballots are available in all of our communities. We encourage you to have conversations with friends and neighbors, and if you have information that you can answer as a result of hearing this today, we hope that you'll share that or encourage them to come and listen to one of our informational sessions. These are also posted on our website, the recordings from these sessions.
So in this district, there are actually two articles that will be on your ballots. The first one is the article to approve the spending level. The second article is the article that gives the district authority to borrow money. Why this is important is that when we start a normal year on July 1, we know that we're not getting money from the state until September. We have payroll to meet with your year-round employees. And so we need this authority to go to a bank and say, we're gonna need a line of credit and we may be in a position where we need to borrow money to make that payroll. The reason that we pushed this second vote out so late and other districts turn votes around within 2 weeks is that we're told that for Article 2, we're still required to give a 30 to 40 day warning period on that to the voters. For a budget revote, we only have to give a 7 to 10 day warning period. So districts that only needed to go for a second budget vote have already been bringing those votes to their voters.
You're saying they didn't need the line of credit?
They got the line of credit.
All right.
So on NMV,
I see.
NMV passed the line of credit and NER didn't.
And
So,
this isn't new, we ask for this every
Yeah,
year
no,
because we need to pay our year-round employees.
so, looking forward, and we certainly hope that this second go at the budget, that both of these articles pass. If the first one goes down and the second one passes, then you can expect that we'll turn around a new budget much quicker, because we know we've got this deadline of June 30th where we really need to get something approved by the voters.
On this side, you're at the first informational session for the Enosburg-Richford district. There's another one that's coming up next Tuesday at 6 o'clock at Enosburg Middle and High School, so you are welcome to also attend that.
And then in terms of where to vote, as Lynn mentioned, you can go to your town clerks now and vote early. Richford will be voting at the town hall, their normal hours. For anybody watching online from Enosburg, that will be at the Public Safety Building, not at the school, which is where they normally vote budget votes. And again, those hours are going to be the same, 10 to 7.
Before we shift to questions, Wally, something that you said earlier has been in my head a little bit in terms of the pressure around tax rates or taxes, like your tax bill. I understand that. I think most of us, all of us live here within FNESU too, so we feel those shifts as well. And I think another thing to remember is that those cost pressures that are pushing on you as a private citizen are also pushing on us as employers. So our health insurance this year alone went up by 16%. And if you think about some of the visuals that Morgan shared and you look at the big piece of the pie that is the people, 16% on a health insurance plan for that number of people is a substantial hit to our budget. We also, if you've gone to the grocery store, you know that food prices are astronomical these days, and we feed a lot of kids. You could see, as Morgan talked about, that portion of the pie that is related to food service across FNESU. The projections for food costs for this next year are really high. We have for the last 2 years been struggling with trying to get an accurate read on what those food costs are going to be. So it's something that I hope that you also remember. The other piece that's also a pressure is, as I indicated earlier, we have a shortage of educators in the country. And what we struggle with, you could see where we land in terms of comparison of what we spend per pupil. We're competing with systems that spend $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $8,000 more per pupil than we do for teachers. So it's been important for us to look at our salary and try to be able to get our teachers and our support staff into a competitive range so that we can hire people. So those are also cost drivers when it comes to what our budget is. So I just think it's important to remember that there are cost pressures that are really pushing hard on us as an employer too. You want to add to that? Does anyone have any questions for us?
Yeah, I'd like to ask, since you brought up the cost pressures, the charts were great and everything, they don't break any of that down, I'm assuming there's material out there, but given that Richford just went through a reassessment, I can say on my end, last year you got an extra 40% out of me. Where's the shortfall to drive another 14%? That's what I want to know.
So I don't know what you mean by shortfall. I'll answer your first question first, is that we'll be putting things like this recording and some of that backup documentation on the website for folks that come to these and don't have access to the web. You can certainly call anyone in our office and we can run it off.
I mean, just as an example, you said healthcare costs are going up by 16%.
Yep.
That's a part of the shortfall, but as we've heard other people already say, 20 to 40% just on the Richford side. Where's the rest of that shortfall coming in that needs an additional 14%? I don't see a breakdown of that where
So
the numbers just don't match up.
You want a
This may
breakdown of
be-
the increases.
Yeah.
So we can provide that. There will never be a direct correlation between that and what one town is paying.
I understand
Because
that.
of that. But yeah, there, you can see kind of a line by line breakdown in the information that we'll post that will say, and here's the instruction line and salaries are up this much and benefits are up this much. So I would say tune into that, look at that, and if that doesn't answer your questions, either come to the next presentation or reach out to one of us directly.
Is that what we put on the website today?
I don't know what we actually got on the website today.
I think that might be.
Might be.
Yeah, to respond to your statement, Lynn, I think everybody gets the cost pressure, but I mean, that 16% is reflected in each private citizen too that pays for their insurance. So are the grocery costs. When your cost of living raise, is 3%, but the expenses go up 5%. Nobody wants to feel like they're walking backwards. And so I can see why people want to dig in their heels and like, all right, enough's enough. You're like, we can't, I'm not going to work the same job and feel like I'm walking backwards. That's frustrating. And that's the problem. And I get it. I mean, but the cost pressures are the same for whether you're in a business or you're a private citizen. So, I mean, I'm just trying to figure out the balance point. Like, I'm all for education, and I don't want to sound like I'm, not supporting the education system, but I also want to have some control over, where my revenues are going, my monies are going, I guess. And it just feels like everything's out of control, to include the school budget this year.
What would the rate be if everything fails? So we all know we're going to have to pay taxes.
Yeah.
That Richford's going to have to support a school in the end, if a budget passes or not. But let's say no budget passes, what would the rate be? And how much more is it going to be? So maybe that, what we're going to have to pay no matter, maybe not as big, the increase won't look as big. If we know what minimum we're going to have to pay anyway, then what pays you have to pay if the budget passes.
So we wouldn't have any way of predicting that until the board made decisions about what or if they were going to reduce their budget. So we'd have to recalculate based on that. We also know that yield number is still moving. So we can't predict this in terms of like trying to help you to narrow it down to what it's exactly going to be until that number lands. So we wouldn't know what that's going to be. But again, I just want to reiterate that we don't have much more that we are going to be able to cut without really risking hitting that floor. So the relief that you're seeking in your tax rate isn't likely going to be the relief that you're hoping for, because you won't pay less than $1 on that district tax rate.
So that's the thing that I just really want to drive home. Anybody who knows me knows I'm a fairly conservative person. And Morgan was on my school board. They pick on me and say I can rub 2 dimes together and get a quarter. And I'm very fiscally responsible. The thing that concerns me, and the thing that really got my attention, was that we're not spending less than $1. We're at $1.04 with the current yield. If that yield goes up, our tax rate goes down, which is great, and the yield could go up. I'm worried that if the budget doesn't pass and people want us to cut more out of the budget, and the yield goes up, so say we get down to $1.02, and the yield goes up, we could be at 98 cents. And then anything, and we're still paying $1, and anything that we didn't vote for a spending plan goes to other communities. And that's the thing that really worries me, and that's why I feel we need to pass this budget, because in my opinion, we're already cutting it close at $1.04, because the yield fluctuates every year.
But that's the point I was trying to make. No matter what the budget is, if it's $1, we're gonna have to pay $1 anyway.
Yes.
So what you want for budget is $1.04, well, you should make people understand that's not that big of an increase.
You're right, John, it
Maybe,
isn't.
maybe that's where it needs to be sold. What is
Right.
I think
on
that
your
people aren't getting
$100,000
that.
number? What
Right,
is
John.
what is
Aren't getting
what is
that.
that for? What is that 4 cents
Yeah,
equal? Can you rough that in your head?
yeah.
$1.05, isn't it?
Yeah, it would be, your tax rate would be 93-ish, 94 cents.
No, but I mean on that,
Oh,
what the dollar amount increase on,
Yeah,
what was it,
completely.
$135 or $118 per 100,000?
Yep.
So what would that difference, that 0.5?
Because we're gonna pay anyway,
Yeah.
no matter what,
I get it.
Yeah,
we're gonna have to pay.
And if we cut more out of it, we're really gambling on our money going elsewhere. And if we're gonna have to pay the taxes, I want the money to stay in our local area.
So I think the other point that, maybe it's not right for the business guy to make it, but, I look at that and say, okay, we're 9th from the bottom. There are 4 districts below us that don't even run schools. Is that a comfortable place for us to be when we're asking more of our teachers and we're asking more of our kids? And the pressures, cost pressures, but also the cost of education generally is really a statewide problem. And I don't know that it's up to the voters in Enosburg-Richford to solve that problem. And I hate to think that we're gonna be decimating our budgets in our schools to solve that when we're, a relatively small piece of the
I think that if
pie.
people have something, a message they need to send to either the governor, the legislators, the superintendent, the principal, then come and have the conversation with me. Voting down the budget is not the way to send the message, because I'm
You're
not
still gonna
sure-
pay.
Right, I'm not sure that the right people are getting the message.
I think that a lot of people, and myself included, were very confused about how this all works, and then seeing that very large increase on top of the large increase that we just already paid was really hard for a bunch of us to swallow. So
Is that
this
the tax rate?
definitely helped me to understand more what we're looking at. So if you're talking about a 4-cent difference between that $1 we're gonna pay anyways and that 4 cents, is that on like every dollar that your house, for the value of your house? Is that what that 4 cents is? So for every like dollar of your house, you're paying 4 cents? That's what I don't understand, where that dollar and
It's the per
what that
thousand.
matters,
Yeah.
what that
Per
dollar
thousand.
And that's
matters.
before the CLA. That the boards don't have control over the CLA.
Right, I
State
just
makes
don't know
that.
what it means, like, that dollar, what does that mean? What am I paying that dollar
Is it
on?
per
The
thousand?
value of my house?
Oh,
Yeah.
yes,
100,000.
yeah,
100,000.
yes.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, per
at what-
thousand,
Yeah.
okay, so that makes it more,
So you're probably
understandable
talking
for me
$6
to calculate on
probably.
my
So it'd
end what
be
that looks like.
Yeah.
928 instead of 981 on 100,000 if we hit $1. So 50-ish bucks.
Time, yeah, so it's about $150 difference. Yeah.
On the 300,000. Is that what you're saying?
So when you look at it that way, it doesn't look as big.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
And I think that's what you need to publicize to the people, that the increase really isn't that big.
Well, the difference between the dollar and the dollar.
You're gonna have to pay no matter what.
Because you're really gambling a little bit because of the yield. We don't know what the yield is.
We really don't
And
know.
how comfortable are you I'm not comfortable getting much closer.
I mean, part of me, I definitely get why the state put that fail-safe in, like, they don't want towns to start spending less because they're getting more from the state. But it also, in some respects, it feels like they created this law to help poor towns, and yet we gotta spend that up to that rate just to keep the money coming in. It almost seems counterintuitive. So, I mean, that's just me trying to wrap my head around it. It's trying to help poor communities, but yet, at least in this year, it's asking us to spend more, you know, even though they're trying to help us. So it just I don't know, it just seems counterintuitive in the way it's working.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
Well, we've studied this for, literally have seen this coming for years. In the last 8-10 months, the amount of time we've spent on this, I feel bad for people who come in and try to understand this in a 1-hour session because it's so complicated. We work on this every single day. We're working on this both here and at the state level, and there's a lot going on there. To Beth's point, if there's a message you want to send, you would be better off to email your legislator, email the governor in terms of the statewide context. But
Let's face it, I think Governor Shumlin gets it, or
Scott.
Scott.
Yeah.
It's our legislators that are the ones struggling with the concept.
I agree.
I think to Morgan's point, the other thing to keep in mind is that cost containment when it comes to a statewide education system, we are way at the bottom. So in terms of us doing our part around cost containment, we've got the efficiency game down. Like what we spend per pupil is incredibly low compared to the rest of the state. I hear what you're saying about the bill, and no one anticipated that idea that there could have been additive spending at both the bottom and the top. They wanted it at the bottom, but they wanted a spending reduction at the top to flatten out that curve, and that's not what happened, and it has created this kind of chaos that we're living in right now.
See, if the top spent less, then the yield would go up and our tax rates would go down. So I'm not really sure it's an us problem.
And we really don't know how that's gonna play out because we had 31 votes go down. We had the 9 that have been revoted, only one's passed as of today. We'll see what happens at the end of the day today. Another 7 are being voted. And so that spending may start coming down and just maybe a natural impact of this year.
I got a couple of questions I had written down before coming here. I have a better understanding and appreciate that. But one thing I thought about is the coaches that you have at the central office. I mean, that's a relatively new aspect. I don't recall coaches, 5 years ago. I don't, like the community knows that.
Courtney's gonna
Is that
put a slide up there, and I'm gonna help explain that.
Okay.
So it goes back to that idea of us really struggling to hire teachers. So we're in a situation where we're hiring teachers who are not trained as teachers. Sometimes they're coming out of other fields or they've had no education background at all. So our data right there shows that whole circle reflects all of our licensed educators. 6% of them are working under an emergency license. 24% are working under a provisional. So our strategy was around retention of those new teachers and trying to build their capacity because they're live in front of students. They're supporting student learning. And so we have coaches who we've strategically placed with those new teachers to try to build their confidence and build their skills and their effectiveness in those roles. The theory of us holding it at the SU level is different, and one of the reasons it's different goes back to that efficiency piece. And Morgan and I have been doing quite a bit of learning around different budgeting strategies, and this was really one of them. So if we have 9 schools and all of them are feeling the pressure of all of these new educators, coming in. And sometimes the pressure might be in Richford this year, and it might be in Montgomery next year, and in Bakersfield the year after. Some of the principals may want to say, I could use an instructional coach that could help me to be in those classrooms more regularly and really support these teachers. So there's this whole, in budget theory, is there's this rounding up effect that happens. So Beth is the master of figuring out portions of people to do jobs. But if Beth were,
Getting people into the building.
right, but if Beth were to advertise for a half-time instructional coach, she probably wouldn't get a candidate. So there would be a temptation to look at the budget and say, I really need an instructional coach. So what if I make this full-time? I'll move something else, I'll make it full-time, and see if I can get a candidate. So she would round up to be able to get a person to come in and do that important work.
I probably wouldn't. I'd get a piece of this one and
You
a piece
would.
of that. Yeah.
In theory, you know what I'm
Yes,
saying?
in theory.
So that rounding up, if you multiply that by, we have 9 schools that are trying to support teachers, our theory was, hold on, let's start with 3 and see if we can take these 3 from our level. We have the flexibility to be more efficient, so we could say, you're going to spend this percentage of your time in this school supporting teachers, and you're going to go here. And we don't really, in that part of the pie that Morgan was talking about in the SU budget around central services, we can't really earmark what percentage goes to each school because it shifts. We hire new teachers all through the year, really, to fill positions. So that's the theory, is to be able to do it more efficiently and effectively at our level and deploy where it's needed, rather than having that rounding up effect.
How many coaches does the central office have?
3.
3 coaches.
Yes.
I mean, I just think, you say there's a teacher shortage, but there are good teachers that have left teaching positions to be coaches.
Yes. And that is, it's by design, and I get it. So if you're looking at it that way, I think we've had this conversation before.
Marty, I just,
Yeah.
I mean, there's another teacher of mine, and it's like, you're taking good teachers.
What you can't see probably is that Marty, the one that you just pointed to, has had a profound impact on dozens of teachers since he's been in that role. He's been able, where he was, his practice could move X number of students that are assigned to him in any given year. He's been able to impact a dozen teachers each year, and if you multiply out all the students that those teachers are in charge of, it's powerful to have someone who's able to elevate each of them.
And if that's the next step on his career path, we sure want it to be within our schools and not go
I
somewhere
get
else.
that part, but I
Yeah.
just think kids might be losing, I mean, if there's a teacher shortage, just taking the good teachers away. Maybe it's my perception. I had another question too. And this isn't something I know for a fact, it's something, because people talk, There were new programs and new staffing when COVID hit. There was money, must be grant money. Beth, I keep looking at you, but I don't need to do that.
Me?
That's okay.
There was grant money provided for new programs,
Yep.
new staffing?
There's a lot of flexibility in
Yes.
how you use it, but yes.
So I'm assuming, the schools obviously took advantage of that money, free money.
Right.
But with the intent, knowing that those programs were going to be not funded, if they were to continue, they need to be funded by the taxpayers.
So those 3 instructional coaches were actually part of that. They were funded out of that ESSER grant.
So that's part of the increase in your.
Yeah, and so the intention actually was, we knew that this ESSER money, it's called the ARP ESSER money, was going to be ending next year for the next budget year. We also knew that was the first year that we were going to see these benefits from these student weights. So a lot of that increased spending was it was thought that we would be able to time it so that we were getting the benefit of those extra kid counts, and keep the tax rate relatively flat as we brought in those. We did not bring them all in. There are some that are going directly into local budgets, some that are going into the SU budgets, and then some that are cut. So it's a mix, but.
And there were other programs, I think, maybe within the schools,
Other positions, other programs, what do you mean?
Maybe not. I like to say, I'm just that's what I.
Well, there was the Flexible Pathways Academy
Yep.
that we paid for with some of that money.
And I
There's-
guess I wonder, you know, when you get grant money, do you look ahead to think, well, when that ends, that money's gone, how's it going to be paid
Yep.
for? And that falls on us, the taxpayers. I
We-
mean,
we
I just wonder
try-
if
we-
you- I just wonder if you think ahead like that.
We
you know?
definitely did in this. There were a lot of ways that we chose not to put it towards staffing because we knew there was going to be this idea of a cliff in the end. But to Morgan's point, we had been working on the projections for Act 127 for 2-3 years at least. So we knew we were going to be heavily advantaged by the shifts in the pupil weights. So we knew that the cliff, that, you know, another system that was more economically advantaged, they were going to have to cut their spending. We knew that we were going to have an opportunity to think about programming and staffing. So in our theory, when we were looking at it, was let's not hire an exorbitant amount of people. Let's do some action research with these and decide which of these are programs that we want to maintain in our schools and which could we release. And then our theory was that those added weights would make it so that it didn't get felt by taxpayers. We had no way of predicting what this year was going to actually do. Like,
Complicated.
yeah, exactly. But we really had those conversations. Any questions online, Courtney? Anyone else? Thank you all for coming out. We appreciate it. If you think of any other questions, feel free to reach out to one of us. And again, we have another meeting coming up next week, so encourage friends and neighbors to come out and join. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.